no sé. Vale, sí.
So, hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about something a little bit different and pleasant, I think, and this is fashion. First of all, I'd like to know if fashion is important for you, and if do you care about fashion in your daily life, or if you just put on the first thing you see in the closet. And I'm asking this because it's well known that fashion is very important for women, because we spend a lot of time thinking about what we're going to wear the following day. And I know this cannot be applied to every woman, but although men have always been the ones who didn't care about clothing, we can see that nowadays they are more and more interested about fashion. And throughout history, beauty ideals have changed, and fashion has always had to adapt itself to the different periods in history. For men, we can say that this evolution hasn't been much complex. Their basic clothing consisted of a trouser, a jacket, a vest, and a shirt. However, women have struggled a lot more. Their clothing became more and more complex, and it even ended up being dangerous for them in the 19th century. In this period, there was a beauty ideal that supported a large bust, an impassable waistline, and broad hips. Some women wore corsets in order to have a perfect bust, and for their hips they wore some kind of frames under their skirts. These frames were made to extend the width of the skirts and to make them look bigger than they actually were. So this was also a way of hiding when a woman was pregnant, like the panier, which was originated in Spain in the 17th century, and in Spanish we call it guardainfantes for that same reason, because it was used to hide pregnancies. This kind of accessories have been used since the 15th century, and I'm sure you'll have seen them in portraits by some artists like Velázquez, for example. It was so difficult to put on this item of clothing that there was even a job to help women wear this clothing. In Spanish, it was called ahuecador, and he helped women to wear this kind of frames. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but these pieces of clothing were obviously worn just by the nobility and aristocracy. At first, women wore underskirts to make their skirts look wider, and they started wearing two or three, but then they started wearing four, five, and even six. And this was essential for fashion, but also for decency. But soon this wasn't enough, and a competition started. Women wanted to wear the widest and most frilly skirt, and they started to wear more and more underskirts, up to 14. So in my opinion, this is something like unbelievable, and I think it must have been so uncomfortable to work with so many pieces of clothing. And I think you won't imagine yourself wearing that neither, because it looks very exhausting. Just imagine what it would be like wearing this in August here in Madrid, for example, with at 40 degrees, and I think it must have been so heavy and unbearable. So these women realized it soon, and it was tried to make wider skirts so that it wasn't necessary to wear underskirts anymore. And a way of doing this was by putting bike tires that were filled up with air or with water. So you can imagine that this latter option, the one with water, could be very embarrassing if something didn't work as expected or if it was broken. These items of clothing were very odd, but the most extravagant one was the crinoline, which is the main topic of the speech. And it is said that the crinoline made women's lives more complicated, that it was necessary to change some pieces of architecture, and that it even caused some deaths. It appeared in Paris in the mid 19th century, and it soon became very popular in Britain as well. At its highest point, it's said that 4,000 crinolines were made every day in London, so you can have an idea of its importance. The best thing about it was that it was worn by all classes, so it was the first piece of clothing that didn't differentiate any classes. And it's true that the railway also contributed to it, because thanks to it, ideas could travel faster and the crinoline could reach small towns quicker. With the crinoline, women didn't have to wear underskirts anymore, and they were made with mane and linen. Its name comes from the words crinis and linum, and it was some kind of like a steel cage. And they were rigid to maintain the skirt shape and flexible to let them move. But everything was difficult with the crinoline. Walking through doors, sitting in a chair, or even getting on a carriage, all of these were very dangerous tasks and sometimes they were even lethal. This is why architecture needed to be changed, as I said before, because women couldn't even enter in their own houses. So bigger doors were built. And you can imagine that it wasn't easy to put on a crinoline. I've talked before about ahuecadores. So in this period, women were helped by their maids who lifted the dress over their heads with the help of some poles. So it was even more difficult. And the most dangerous thing about crinolines was that they could be easily set on fire. You should remember that in this period, fire was used to cook, to light up, and even fireplaces were also very popular. So it was so hard to work with a crinoline without touching anything lying around that some women ended up dying when they got too close to a fireplace and their skirt was set on fire. And you may think that I'm exaggerating, but actually in 1858 the New York Times published an article talking about the danger of the crinoline. They said it caused 3 deaths per week. And the most awful case happened the 8th of December 1863. More than 200 people died in a church in Chile. The reason of the deaths was a candle. It, was, it caused a fire in the altar and this fire was quickly spread. And all the people who were there, they tried to run away, but it was impossible for the women who were wearing crinolines. So many of them were trapped in the church and they finally died. And right now I'm going to read an extract of an article that was published in that period and that illustrates very well the life of those women who wore crinolines. It was a beautiful spring day and the Parisian restaurant was crowded with diners. When a gentleman appeared with a woman in a crinoline on his arm, the diners glanced up as the woman began to make her way through the crowded tables. Suddenly, the woman whose crinoline, although of ordinary dimensions being none more than 6 yards wide, began to show symptoms of rebellion on passing between the chairs, and at last, the skirt and its wearer absolutely refused to move, although energetically urged to do so by the gentleman's cane. As the woman struggled to loosen her dress and move forward, the crowd all rose to gaze on the spectacle. Waiters left their positions, diners flocked to the center of the restaurant, and crowds came pouring through the restaurant to see the woman whose foolish desire to be fashionable had led her to be cemented in place. So here you have an example of how life with a crinoline was and how difficult it was to do ordinary things. But it's true that it wasn't all that bad. Crinolines had a lot of disadvantages and they were very uncomfortable, but they were also very useful for some other things. For example, during the American Civil War, many Southern women hid smuggled weapons to take them to the Confederate States, and as the crinoline was very big, no one noticed what was in it. By the 1880s, the popularity of the crinoline decreased a lot, and the crinolet appeared. It was a smaller version of the crinoline whose front was flat. Then in the 20th century, during World War II, there was another version called the word crinoline. And the word crinoline was practical and it was considered to be patriotic. And this is why a lot of women wore them when they went to say goodbye to the soldiers when they left to war. And nowadays, in the 21st century, crinolines are still worn, and we can see them in wedding dresses or even prom dresses in the United States. Although it's true that they're not as dangerous as they used to be before. So that's all about crinolines, and I hope you've learned something new about fashion and about how women have always struggled to look nice no matter what. And I also hope that after this speech you watch out what you're wearing, because sometimes being beautiful doesn't mean that you're going to be practical or even safe. Thank you.